Good afternoon. If Mr. Baxter could come in. Good afternoon, Mr. Baxter.
Good afternoon, my lord.
Good afternoon, Mr. Baxter.
Afternoon.
Could we have document, so from volume 3, bundle 3, volume 2, at page 354, please? If you have that in front of you, Mr. Baxter, do we see this is a note of an RHSC DCN project discussion 1st of February 2011 with various people listed in attendance? Jackie Sainsbury, Susan Goldsmith, Ian Graham, yourself, and Norman Kinnear and Donna Stevenson.
Yes.
Sorry, Mr. McLennan, entirely my fault. Could you give me the page again? I think
it's bundle 3, volume 2, page 354.
Page
354.
24. Yeah.
54.
Thank you. Yeah, that is okay. I thought he said volume 3. Yes. Sorry, Mr. McLennan.
There's just one passage in this note of that meeting that I'd like to ask you about, Mr. Baxter. And it's on page 355. And it's in the second paragraph beginning on that page. Reading from there, it says, the meeting then discussed the design position in terms of work done and required before procurement commences. The ongoing work from BAM through Framework Scotland remains possible to add in DCN aspects. However, there are a range of risks around timescale, etc. It's really this coming sentence. Donna Stevenson said that while SFT supported the concept of a reference design, she was surprised as to the extent of the design development being proposed. First of all, was Donna Stevenson from the SFT?
Yes.
And do you recall the SFT expressing surprise at the extent of the design development?
Not explicitly. Bearing in mind that this paragraph refers to DCN, so I'm not sure what her concern was about, whether it was the extent of design work on sick kids or the fact that DCN was now being introduced. So I can't comment further, I'm afraid.
Okay. Could we go please to page 377, that bundle? We see there that this is a letter dated the 22nd of March 2011 from the Acting Director General of Health and Social Care, Mr Derek Feely.
Yes.
And we see the letter is headed up, Scottish Government funding conditions for delivering projects through the non-profit distributing model.
Yes.
Is this a document you're familiar with?
Yes.
Can you explain to us what it is, please?
Yes. So this goes wider than health, but essentially what the Scottish Government were seeking to do was to recognise that the impact of non-profit distributing as a means of finance there was a differential impact on public authorities in terms of the budget impact, and also that in order to deliver these projects, which were inherently complex projects to start with, but to make sure that they were robust, there were certain conditions set out around the governance of those projects.
Okay. Were these the first such conditions that had been issued by the Scottish Government for NPD projects?
In terms of the funding of NPD projects, yes, it would be.
And just picking up about the third paragraph on the first page, says this letter sets out the key conditions and guidance for procuring bodies in the development and delivery of their projects in relation to 1, the anticipated scope, construction and building operating costs for the project, 2, capacity and governance structures which the procuring body must put in place in order to deliver the project effectively. And then 3, requirements in terms of business cases and value for money assessment, and so on. And then in the following paragraph, it provides that as project owner, a procuring body is required to comply in full with the conditions and guidance set out in this letter in order to be eligible to receive revenue support for agreed projects. So, as it suggests there, these are conditions which a health board, for example, would have to comply with to secure NPD funding from the government. And then over the page, at page 378, first paragraph that begins on that page provides that the programme is being supported by the Scottish Futures Trust. SFT provides a valuable centre of expertise and advice on the development, funding, structuring, procurement and management of these projects. Procuring bodies are therefore asked to work closely with SFT throughout the development of the project. SFT's approval will be required at specific points, as detailed in section 2 and 5 of the attached guidance, in order for the project to proceed to delivery. Now, is it fair to say that there are described here 2 aspects to the role of the SFT? 1, an advisory role, and 2, an approval role?
Yes, and the approval role was in relation to recommendations to the Scottish Government, and that was more broadly than health. That applied across the entire programme.
Just to be clear about that, do you mean that the requirements for the SFT's approval would apply to each of the individual NPD projects, whether they were health or not?
Yes.
Yep.
And in my experience, exercised through their undertaking of key stage reviews at various points in the procurement process, so that those were effectively gateways that needed to be passed through before projects proceeded to the next stage of development or procurement.
So when the letter refers to the approval of the SFT, is that a reference to the key stage review process?
That's my interpretation of it, yes.
Was this the first time that Scottish Government funding had been made conditional on SFT approval?
Yes. I think it's important to say, though, that for private finance schemes in health, prior to this programme, the funding requirement fell on the relevant NHS board. There was no additional funding provided directly by Scottish Government by way of support. So the terms that are set out in this letter sought to recognise the differential impact, financial impact of NPD as opposed to public capital, and to provide direct funding to compensate for that fact.
Thank you. And to be clear about it, the approvals of the SFT, was that instead of or in addition to the approval by the Scottish Government through the Capital Investment Group process?
That's in addition to.
If you could move, please, to page 379. There's a heading, Anticipated Scope, Construction and Building Operating Costs for the Project, and then a list of conditions. And condition 1E reads as follows. In order for the project to enter procurement, the procuring body must satisfy both the Scottish Government and SFT that it has sought to minimise construction costs and operating costs within the agreed project scope and has undertaken a whole-of-life cost analysis. This will form part of the scrutiny of the outlined business case prepared for the project before approval is given for any procurement to commence. How was that satisfaction of the Scottish Government and SFT to be achieved?
In the case of sick kids, effectively that that analysis was undertaken through the design review process that's undertaken by Atkins. I think it's important to say that in terms of the term minimise construction cost and operating cost is not at the expense of compliance with standard. This was around the broader scope of the project, that it was specified to deliver the services that had been identified as being required.
Okay. And if you go, please, to page 380, it's headed up to capacity and governance required to deliver the project effectively. And again, a list of conditions. Condition E is the project will be required to go through the gateway review, key stage review, and post-project occupancy evaluation as directed by the Scottish Government through the development phase until financial close is reached. The review process should be undertaken in full from the earliest applicable milestone. And insofar as that refers to key stage review, is that the SFT review that you talked about a moment ago?
Yes, that's correct.
There's reference here also to gateway review. Who was to conduct the gateway review?
So gateway review was a process originally introduced by the Office of Government Commerce, OGC, on a UK basis, and sought to provide external assurance around major projects through independent reviews. In the Scottish Government context, those were arranged through Scottish Government. I'm trying to remember whether it was at SG Finance. There was a central team in Scottish Government that coordinated gateway review activity across all sectors and would identify reviewers not connected with the project to undertake those reviews at various stages. So that was a long-established process. The differential between the two was that gateway review was really focused around project governance and planning, and the key stage review was focused around those commercial aspects related to the NPD model or private finance model more generally.
Okay, if I can try and just capture what we've got, because we have a series of different reviews.
Yeah.
So we've got the business case review process before the CIG. And in addition to that, we've got the gateway reviews conducted by a body within the Scottish Government.
Or commissioned by, sorry, I should be clear. So the gateway reviews were commissioned by a body within the Scottish Government, but the gateway review reports were effectively provided to the project owner or the project sponsor. So in the context of health, the report would be provided to the senior responsible officer in the health board concerned, but also provided as in copy to the Director General as well.
Okay. If we just stand back from it, the purpose of the review process before the Capital Investment Group was to ensure the project complied with the Scottish Public Finance Manual and the SCIM.
I would say it's not, in terms of gateway review, it's not as specific as that.
Sorry, I'm not asking.
Sorry.
Yeah. It's my fault, Mr. Baxter. I'm just trying to set out the different review processes that applied for a project, and two of them are described here in this letter, the gateway review and the key stage review. But in addition to that, there's also the process before the Capital Investment Group. That's correct.
And both of those processes that are referred to here, the gateway review and key stage review process, feed into the CIG consideration. So at various points, they would be undertaken. The recommendations from those reviews would be picked up in business cases, and CIG would certainly be seeking assurance that the recommendations that had been made in those reviews had been picked up and addressed.
I see. Thank you. And all I'm trying to do is capture what you've said to make sure I've understood it. So the gateway review, I think you said, was concerned with assessment of project governance.
Project governance, risk, just good governance principles really that should underpin major projects.
Okay, and the key stage review process conducted by the SFT, I think you said was concerned with the commercial aspects relevant to NPD specifically.
Yes, so those review processes would typically, or sort of from my recollection, initially predate the commencement of a procurement. So is the project ready to proceed to procurement? And at various stages, interim stages through the procurement process would be undertaken. So in the situation of a competitive dialogue process, invitation to participate in dialogue, there would be pre-preferred bidder when the chosen bidder was being selected, and pre-financial close. That's my recollection. So those provided interim checkpoints through the procurement process before a full business case was submitted.
Okay, and do we have, in addition to that, the NDAP process that we discussed this morning?
The NDAP process is effectively part of the CIG process or SCIM process.
Okay. So was the project for the sick kids required to undergo both key stage review and gateway review processes?
So when the project commenced, or prior to the NPD funding, it would have been subject to gateway review. At that point, key stage review was introduced following the decision around funding. I can't recall whether those two processes ran in parallel post NPD decision and pre-full business case. I can't recall whether the two things ran in parallel or not.
Right. If you still have page 380 up on screen there, Mr. Baxter, do we see that underneath the conditions, there's a section headed guidance?
Yes.
Project resourcing. And it says the skills and experience of the project director and the wider project team needed to deliver a successful revenue finance project are outlined as follows. The project team should have knowledge and experience of revenue finance procurement, be able to provide a challenge function to advisors and bidders. Can you just explain why that was needed?
The nature of a private finance procurement is quite distinct from traditional public capital, and there is a heavy reliance on advisors, whether they be legal, financial or technical, because of the nature of financing and procurement. So that requirement was put in order that the board would have effectively an intelligent client function to be able to question and to challenge the advice that it was receiving.
Okay. And then reading on, missing the next two bullets, it says the project team should have the experience and expertise necessary to successfully manage and deliver the key phases in project procurement. Specifically, then reading on, the competitive dialogue process as appropriate, and have the confidence and experience to lead detailed, wide-ranging and complex negotiations with bidders in relation to the technical, commercial and financial aspects of the project. And again, can you explain why that requirement's in there?
In order that the client can ensure that it gets what it's specifying and requiring through the procurement process, and to challenge the proposals coming forward from bidders, which could be quite different in terms of their nature.
And then just reading over the page to page 381, I think it is. In addition to the expertise outlined above, project team must have sound knowledge of these important aspects of procuring revenue finance projects, design and risk transfer, amongst others. Again, why is that requirement included here?
Because of the nature of NPD projects, where the extent to which design rests with the client or the bidder. The nature of risk transfer impacts on the balance sheet treatment, which impacts on how these projects score in budgets and therefore on affordability.
And was assessment of these matters on a particular project something that was within the scope of either the Gateway Review or the Key Stage Review?
Of the two, the specific aspects of this, I would suggest are in the context of Key Stage Review rather than Gateway Review.
Those are things within the purview of the SFT?
Yes, although the expertise of a project team expertise and experience of a project team is something that a Gateway Review would typically look at in more general terms, but the specific aspects in relation to NPD, I would say are more relevant to Key Stage Review.
But whichever of these two reviews it was done through, did I understand you to say that it would come to the attention of the CIG anyway, because they would be aware of the outcome of those reviews when considering the business case?
That's correct.
To what extent, in your view, did NHS Lothian's project team have that sort of expertise?
I don't have access to detail in order to form that judgment, I'm afraid.
If we could go please to page 383, this is headed up number 3, requirements for value for money assessment and business cases. And then we see there a sets of conditions to do with the outline business case stage and the full business case stage.
Yep.
And at paragraphs B and F, we see reference to both the Scottish Ministers and the SFT. The SFT are described as having an oversight role, and it's said that they'll provide comment to the Scottish Ministers prior to their formal approval. Can you just explain the role of the SFT in this value for money context?
Yeah, so part of the, again, it's linked to Key Stage Review in part, but there was guidance developed by Scottish Futures Trust to assess value for money in NPD schemes, and part of their role was to assess how that guidance had been applied. The information that was provided by SFT, as I've indicated, fed into consideration by CIG if there were any issues that were highlighted through Key Stage Review. And at the point that we were considering business cases, SFT had an advisory role in respect of the CIG. So,
yeah. Okay, and just to be clear, we're looking at a whole set of conditions in this letter. We haven't gone to all of them. Was it still separately from all of that a prerequisite for approval that the project met the requirements of the Scottish Capital Investment Manual?
Yes, and I would argue that there's nothing in the guidance here that is inconsistent with the requirements of the scheme.
Can we go please to document, sorry, it's Bundle 3, Volume 2, page 399. Now, if you have that in front of you, Mr Baxter, you should see that it's a letter from the Scottish Futures Trust, dated the 1st of June 2011, Jackie Sainsbury of NHS Lothian.
Yes, I can see that.
And if we just scroll forward to page 408, we can see that the letter is from Peter Reekie, and it's carbon copied to you. Do you see that?
Yes.
Yeah. And just go back to page 399, just reading from the letter. Further to the letter NHS Lothian received on the 22nd of March 2011 from the Scottish Government with regard to the funding conditions for delivering projects through the non-profit distributing model. That's the letter we've just been looking at. Yep. We are following up on certain specific matters as they relate to the funding of the combined NPD project at Little France. And then reading on funding conditions, construction costs. The letter of 22 March 2011 made it clear that the Scottish Government would fund 100% of construction costs, subject to a scope for construction being agreed between the procuring body and the Scottish Government, which will be supported by SFT in this assessment. Below is set out how we propose to reach agreement on the scope of the project, and therefore how a cap on this element of funding will be set. Then reading on to the next paragraph, as part of an updated key stage review process that will be applied uniformly on NPD projects in the health sector, we propose to engage in the ongoing design process of the project to provide an independent review and challenge the overall size of this facility and its specification on behalf of the ultimate funder of the project. To do this, we are likely to employ an external advisor. This should provide independent validation of some of the key high-level metrics of the design and a valuable external benchmark on value for money. And so on. So there's reference here to a review of the design by an external advisor appointed by the SFT. How, if at all, did that design review relate to the funding conditions we've just been looking at?
So the review that was undertaken on behalf of SFT, I believe by Atkins, sought to test the assumptions around the sizing of the facility and the cost metrics that had been assumed in establishing the estimate. That was important in respect to the funding conditions because 100% of the capital cost was effective, the elements of the unitary payments to be paid by the board, 100% of the elements of that relating to the capital, the cost of the building and the debt to service it, were to be supported by government. So that was an important independent check for government around the assumptions that underpinned the business case.
Mm-hmm. And if we go forward, please, to page 407 of that letter. There's a heading there, Assurance and Approvals. In relation to the project, SFT will review and provide support to CIG in its consideration of both the outline business case and the full business cases for the project. Such comments will include whether, from our perspective, there are any issues that should be rectified prior to the approval of the business case. What sort of issues did you expect SFT to identify?
Any issues in relation to the funding conditions that had been set out. Also just in terms of the development of the procurement materials to support, depending on what stage we're talking about here. At outline business case, it would be pre-procurement and therefore, the preparations for that procurement activity. At full business case stage, it would be in relation to closing out the contract and making sure that issues had been resolved satisfactorily. So the nature of the investigation really depends on the stage at which the SFT were conducting the review, and that's why we had key stage reviews at the various stages that are set out in that letter, and because the issues would be different at each of those stages.
Did you expect the SFT, whether through external advisors or otherwise, to detect non-compliance of the project with technical guidance such as SHTMs?
No, I wouldn't have. I didn't see that as their role.
Could we go please to Bundle 3, Volume 2, page 484. And if that's before you, Mr Baxter, we see it's headed up Infrastructure Investment Board,
Yeah.
26 September 2011, and a reference to the Sick Kids project. What is or was the Infrastructure Investment Board?
So this was a board that was convened under the leadership of the Director General for Finance at the time in Scottish Government, and it was to provide oversight on the delivery of major capital investment projects, typically those over 50 million from memory, and it would consider some general issues with regard to infrastructure investment, including the use of NPD, but it would maintain an oversight on the delivery of those projects as they progress through. And this paper refers to such an update in respect of sick kids.
I think you said that it was under the leadership of the Director General of Finance.
Correct.
Just to be clear, that's outside the directorates that we were talking about earlier being
Yes,
concerned
this is within the broader Scottish Government.
And you said it has its oversight role. Was that the nature of its role in relation to the Sick Kids project?
Yes, I would. That's how I would describe it. Yes.
And who sat on the Infrastructure Investment Board?
I couldn't give you a precise list, but it was chaired. It was chaired by the then DG Finance Alison Stafford. There was well, it's important to say there was involvement from SFT and from various portfolios within government, although not all portfolios were represented, including health. I don't recall health actually being a member of the Infrastructure Investment Board.
Okay, so just to be clear, did you have any role on the Infrastructure Investment Board?
Only in terms of providing updates and advice in the delivery of the health programme periodically. But I wasn't a member of the board.
Now, if we go forward to page 486, paragraph 13, just reading from that. This paper to the Infrastructure Investment Board tells them that NHS Lothian is developing a reference design for an integrated RHSC DCN in order to facilitate a speedy delivery and minimise the upfront costs for bidders. This means that most of the design development, except in relation to mechanical and electrical design, will be done before the project enters procurement, rather than bidding contractors preparing detailed designs themselves. Although it potentially limits innovation, this approach should increase the attractiveness of the project to bidders and allow for a more certain overall cost for the project at outline business case stage. As part of a needs not wants challenge, SFT is undertaking an independent review of the design. Do you agree with the benefits stated there about the reference design approach?
Yes, I would.
And what was meant by the reference to a needs not wants challenge?
It was really just ensuring that the building scope that had been included in the cost estimate matched up with the service requirement. So there was, a need for overall cost control across the programme, and it was just ensuring that there wasn't additional or unnecessary capacity built in to the estimate, because there was an opportunity cost of that for other programmes.
Is that a reference to the review that you described as having been carried out by Atkins?
Yes, that's right.
And there's a reference there to most of the design development being done before the project enters procurement, except in relation to mechanical and electrical design.
Yeah.
Does that reflect your understanding of the position?
Yes, and that's what I would describe as a reference design.
If we could go to bundle 7, page 455, please. Is this a document you recognise, Mr. Baxter?
Not immediately, I have to say, but
Okay, well, if we see it's headed up, Scottish Government governance arrangements for Royal Hospital for Sick Children and so on, outline business case. And if we scroll forward to page 457, we see a recommendation. Project Board is asked to note the arrangements for OBC consideration within Scottish Government, and it's got your name there, 7th of October 2011.
okay.
So, well, 11 years ago, so
Yeah.
you can be forgiven perhaps for not remembering it. But so do we take it then that this was a paper to the Project Board of NHSL?
Yes, that would be my reading of the intent of it, yes.
Okay, and just to put it in context, paragraph 1 says that this report sets out the arrangements within Scottish Government for the consideration of the OBC currently being prepared, and so on. And then if we go to paragraph 10, which is on page 456, what you say there is as follows. Process within Scottish Government for consideration of the OBC is unchanged from that which NHS Lothian colleagues would be familiar with. At present, a number of other bodies, including Architecture and Design Scotland and Health Facilities Scotland, feed into the overall approval process. It is expected that the SFT consideration of VFM, that stands for value for money,
Yes.
And other issues referred to in the 22 March letter will form part of the overall CIG assessment process. In that regard, there is no separate board approval within SFT for approval of the RHSC DCN project, and that this will be part of the Scottish Government's consideration as normal. Now, you refer here to an existing process which is unchanged, and to Architecture and Design Scotland and Health Facilities Scotland. And I wondered if you were referring here, perhaps amongst other things, to the NDAP process.
That would be the natural engagement of Architecture and Design Scotland and Health Facilities Scotland. Although I can't be specific as to what that was my intent or not. Architecture and Design Scotland had a statutory function in relation to planning. Health Facilities Scotland provide advice to the NHS, and they provided advice to Scottish Government as well as and when required. So that advisory role would be consistent with the existing CIG process.
Okay. And you've referred to these three bodies, Architecture and Design Scotland, Health Facilities Scotland and the SFT. Was the SFT design review intended in any way to overlap with the roles of Architecture and Design Scotland and Health Facilities Scotland?
The design review that was undertaken by SFT was done for a particular function as indicated in the funding conditions letter. What I'd sought to do, and unfortunately I don't have a recollection of how it was followed through, was to make sure that SFT, Architecture and Design Scotland and Health Facilities Scotland got together in terms of understanding that, where they were in terms of those processes, so that there was alignment.
Okay.
But I can't recall the detail of it, I'm afraid. I'm sorry.
Okay, well, we'll have a look at some of the correspondence around that a little bit later. If we can go, please, to Bundle 3, Volume 2, at page 567. Do we see there, Mr Baxter, that this is a report by Atkins dated the 12th of December 2011, and it's headed up Royal Hospital for Sick Children, Department of Clinical Neurosciences, Independent Design Review, Scottish Futures Trust.
Yes, I can see that.
So is this the Atkins, or the report by Atkins following the review that we've just been discussing?
That's my understanding of what it is, yes.
If we could go, please, page 571. And there's a heading there, Summary and Recommendations, and just reading from below that. The purpose of this independent review was to assess the design brief for the project replace the Royal Hospital for Sick Children, the Department of Clinical Neurosciences on the Little France site. The review assessed the capacity of the project to deliver value for money by meeting the strategic aims of the programme, by making best use of space and opportunities for maximising sharing with other assets, by minimising the whole-of-life costs. The recommendations are intended to indicate actions which will help de-risk the specification and the reference design as the project progresses towards OBC and the preparation of tender documentation to improve value for money. Does that summary accurately summarise what you understood to be Atkins' remit?
I can't comment on Atkins' remit, but in terms of what SFT's role was, it's consistent with what SFT's role was, my understanding of it.
Yes, so what we've read there, that would fulfil what the Scottish Government expected of the SFT's design review.
Yes.
The second paragraph there has a phrase about de-risking the specification and the reference design. It says that recommendations are intended to indicate actions which will help to de-risk the specification and the reference design. What would you understand that to be about?
I couldn't comment on the specific intent of that, other than to say that the aim of this was to provide as much clarity on the reference design as possible prior to procurement. So by providing clarity, that's one element of de-risking, but I couldn't comment on the specifics of risk that are referred to.
From your perspective on the CIG, were there any particular risks associated with specifications and reference designs that you might expect the SFT to detect?
Not specifically. I think in terms of the capacity of the building and the spatial configuration of the building, those would be things I would expect them to pick up from a value for money perspective, but nothing more specific than that.
And just to be clear, would you have expected it to detect any potential failure to meet technical standards such as SHTMs?
No.
If you go please to page 576. About 2/3 of the way down the page, there's a heading Reference Design. And it reads, at the point of our review, the reference design was relatively underdeveloped, considering the stage of the project. Are you able to comment on what stage the design had reached at the time of this review?
No, I can't.
If you go please to page 636. This is a chapter 7, headed up Reference Design. Again, I'm just going to read from it. The aim of this section of the review is to assess value for money in the creation of the environment for patients and staff. 7.1, Design Quality Statement. The project was instigated before the incorporation into the procurement process of the guidance from Architecture and Design Scotland on ensuring design quality in healthcare buildings in Scotland. However, the objectives of this process still apply to the project, and it will be monitored by A&DS. A&DS recommend the preparation of a design statement. Then it carries on. A&DS describes the function of the design statement as follows. And then picking up about halfway through that quoted paragraph, about 5 lines from the top, it says, at later stages, the emerging design is then assessed against the requirements and standards in the design statement and related healthcare specific guidance, primarily as part of the board's own self-assessment, but also by the NDAP in order to provide advice to decision makers within the board and the CIG regarding the extent to which the project is on track to deliver the standards established. And would that be a reference to the NDAP that we had been discussing this morning?
Yes. Yes, it would.
And were you aware of what this report had said about the NDAP?
I can't recall at the time. I've had the opportunity to review the report in advance of this hearing, but at the time I can't recall having sight of this report or the detail of it, or memory of the detail of it.
And just reading on, there's a heading below of AEDET, and I acknowledge what you said this morning, that this is not something within your area of expertise. But just if we go to page 637, there's a heading RHSC DCN AEDET. NHS Lothian undertook an AEDET on the 12th of August 2011. Attendees at the workshop were members of staff and so on. And then there's a table below that, and do you see at line F, entry for engineering, 0 out of 5 scored? See that?
Yep.
And then at paragraph 7.2.3, it says a number of elements are unable to be scored at this stage because the design is insufficiently developed. In particular, performance, engineering and construction cannot be scored at this stage. Does any of that mean anything to you?
The only thing I would say is that as a reference design prior to procurement, the detailed engineering and electrical design isn't complete at that stage. So if that's when the review is undertaken, then that would be right.
Okay. If you go forward, please, to page 644. Paragraph 7.8, there's a heading, Building Services and Progress to BREEAM. The approach to building services design progress towards a high BREEAM score was not assessed as it anticipated this will form part of the technical monitoring of the project by both the Scottish Government and HFS. Do you agree that that building services design and progress towards a high BREEAM score would form part of technical monitoring of the project by the Scottish Government and HFS?
I'm not sure whether the term technical monitoring is right, but BREEAM as a toolkit would be assessed, and the expertise and HFS would be used to undertake that assessment in conjunction with the relevant NHS board.
And the reference there to assessment or technical monitoring of the project, would you understand that to be a reference to the NDAP process?
Not specifically, because BREEAM is a separate issue. So that's around environmental impact of a facility and a means of. There are various scores that are attributed in terms of BREEAM excellent, which means it's very, very efficient in terms of energy and sustainability.
Well, if we read the paragraph as referring to two separate things, being the approach to building services design on the one hand and progress towards a high BREEAM score on the other, insofar as the paragraph then refers to technical monitoring, would you understand that to be a reference to the NDAP?
That's fair. Yes. Or an equivalent process.
Sorry, just bear with me, Mr. Baxter, for a moment, please. If we could go, please, to Bundle 3, Volume 2, page 650. And this is a document headed up with the logos of the Scottish Government and the Scottish Futures Trust. And it's given the title Validation of Revenue Funded Projects, the Key Stage Review Process, Information Note to Projects. Are you familiar with this?
Yes, I would have been at the time as well. Yep.
Can you just explain briefly what it is?
This, bearing in mind the timing of this in December 2011, was to provide supplementary information to projects on what the requirements would be underpinning revenue funded projects and specifically the application of the key stage review process.
And if you go forward to page 652, as you've just suggested, the first paragraph there says, it's been written to provide an overview of the key stage review process. Its aim is to explain the process to project sponsor, senior responsible officers involved in revenue funding projects. And at paragraph 1.2, just about 4 lines from the top, there's a reference there to SFT's role is to carry out a high-level review of the outlined business case. In relation to centrally funded health projects, SFT may conduct a detailed review of the proposed design specification and provide comment to the Scottish ministers or project sponsors in order to inform their own approval process. Is that a reference to the sort of thing done by Atkins in relation to the sick kids?
Yeah, the Atkins work would have informed that. But that in my view is entirely consistent with the guidance on funding conditions issued in March of 2011.
And at page 654, there's a description of what the key stage review person is to do. And just reading from paragraph 1.4, the second sentence says that the overall role of the reviewer is to ensure that best practice and relevant guidance are applied and to advise projects in this regard throughout the procurement process. What do you understand it to be referring to when it mentions best practice and relevant guidance?
So relevant guidance is in respect to the NPD process. So within the scheme itself, there was a PPP guide. So that formed a long-standing part of the scheme. There was also the supplementary material that had been provided as part of the funding conditions material. So I would expect that to be the relevant guidance.
Yeah. Now, you were asked when giving your statement about whether an NDAP was carried out for the Sick Kids project, and your answer was that you couldn't remember, but that you assumed one was. And in giving that answer, you referred to a paragraph in the outline business case from 2012. And if we just look at that, it's in Bundle 3, Volume 2, page 685. And it's paragraph 1.70 on that page. And just reading from there, it says that this is the outline business case prepared by NHSL. It says the reference design and development of the final design with the preferred bidder will both be subject to a range of reviews as work progresses. To date, these have included the following. Findings from each have influenced the ongoing design development. Then there's a list of bullets referencing Architecture and Design Scotland workshops, AEDET, HAI Scribe, Infection Control, and Health Facilities Scotland NDAP Design Assessment. So NHSL at least appear to be saying there that their design had been subject to an NDAP by HFS. Do you agree?
What I said in my written statement was that I believe I couldn't recall whether an NDAP or an equivalent process had been followed, but based on what's contained in paragraph 1.7 or 170, those are the component parts of what I would have expected. But I have no personal recollection of an NDAP report, for example, being prepared.
Was the statement in the outline business case that the design had been subject to an NDAP, a matter of significance to the CIG in deciding whether or not to approve the outline business case?
It would have been a component of the assessment undertaken, and also with the advice that's provided by both Architecture and Design Scotland and Health Facility Scotland to inform that if there'd been an issue with that, then I would have expected that to have been highlighted in CIG's consideration.
If you just turn it around, if the outline business case had said that no NDAP had been carried out, what would have happened then?
Well, there would have been challenge around. There would have been challenge around that in terms of what assurances have been sought by the board on the basis of those assurances. But that and I can only reflect on the fact that the OBC was considered and approved, that statement, bearing in mind that statement had been considered by NHS Lothian and its board, is factually correct.
Okay. Do you recall if there was any uncertainty around the time of the outline business case and its preparation about whether or not an NDAP should be carried out?
I've no personal recollection of it, but because of the nature of the project, and in this case we're talking about sick kids with DCN included, it was quite an iterative process around the development of the business case.
If we go please to Bundle 3, Volume 2, page 655. Do we see there, Mr Baxter, this is an email from Donna Stevenson of the Scottish Futures Trust to you,
yep.
Dated 28th of December 2011. What she says is, Mike, in August, Colin, Viv and I met with Bettina and Heather of Architecture and Design Scotland and Peter Henderson of HFS to discuss the relationship between the SFT design review and the input of Architecture and Design Scotland and HFS to the project review. At the meeting, we agreed that we would send A&DS and HFS the independent design review report once it was completed. They will consider the gaps which still need to be covered. At the time, we sent on the remit of the review to Heather. In view of the time which has elapsed since then, I do not know whether matters have developed. Perhaps when you're back after the festive season, you could let me know whether you wish me to send on the report or whether you wish to do so in the context of any other discussions which may have taken place. Now, the reference in that email to the SFT design review, is that the Atkins report?
Yes, I believe so. I'm not aware of any other report apart from the Atkins report.
What you say in your statement, I don't think we need to bring it up, but just for the record, the references to page 110 of the witness statement bundle. It's paragraph 106 of your statement. You said that in December 2011, I had requested the SFT Atkins design review report to be shared with HFS and A&DS to ensure that there was an alignment of processes that had existed at the earlier stages of the RHSC project, and those subsequently introduced as part of the design quality policy for NHS Scotland, introduced in 2010. I have no recollection of the nature of the follow-up to this request.
Yeah.
When you refer there to the processes subsequently introduced as part of the 2010 design policy, is that a reference to the NDAP?
Yeah, that is, yes.
And when you say you'd wanted the report to be sent on to ensure that there was an alignment of processes, what do you mean by that?
Well, essentially essentially making sure that what SFT were doing as, and given their responsibilities as part of the kind of MPD funding conditions, that we were joining the dots across the three organisations to make sure there was full coverage. Bearing in mind what we've already covered around SFT's role and what it wasn't in relation to, it wasn't about compliance with technical standard, for example.
Can I put it this way? Were you hoping to achieve what an NDAP would have achieved?
I can't. I would be speculating if that's, you know, if I said yes.
What did you see as the relationship between the SFT design review by Atkins and the NDAP process as set out in the 2010 policy?
I would have seen them as complementary, because the information that was gleaned by Atkins in terms of the spatial awareness, the cost information, would have supported a more broad and general review of design of the new facility.
I mean, were you clear in your own mind about how they related to one another?
I can't really kind of say what my thought process was back at the end of 2011, to be blunt.
Yeah,
trying to be difficult, but yeah.
Are you clear now about how they related to one another?
On review of the material, I would have seen them as complementary, and therefore the sharing of information would have been important to make sure that everything that needed to be covered was covered.
Just so that I'm following, you'd have seen the Atkins report as complementary to a hypothetical NDAP. Have I got that, or have I got that wrong?
So the information contained in the Atkins report would have been useful in that wider consideration of design by Architecture and Design Scotland and Health Facilities Scotland. But the NDAP is quite explicit in terms of what the responsibilities of both of those bodies is, and in terms of their investigation.
Thank
you. If we could have Bundle 3, Volume 2, page 880, please. Now this is kind of the middle of an email chain, but if we go right down to the bottom of that page,
could you give me the page number?
It's Bundle 3, Volume 2, page 880.
Thank you.
Do we see it at the bottom of that page, Mr. Baxter? There's an email from Peter Henderson, dated of NSS. In fact, if we read down, we see that he's the principal architect at Health Facilities Scotland.
Yes.
His email is dated 27th of January 2012, sent to Donna Stevenson, I think of the SFT.
Correct.
And copied to various people, including you. And the subject is Edinburgh RHSC Design Review. And what Mr. Henderson says is, Donna, as requested by Mike at last week's meeting, my comments on Atkins' report are attached. That suggests that you had asked HFS to review the Atkins report.
Which is what I said in the statement, yes.
Yep. These mostly reinforce Atkins' comments rather than adding anything new. I haven't seen the latest detailed drawings or specification information. Was that a matter of concern to you that HFS had not seen the latest detailed drawings or specification information?
I don't have a context against which to make that judgment, I'm afraid, in terms of what activity they were engaged in at that time and whether they should have seen at that point or not.
Okay. He goes on to say, if they have not already prepared one, I think it would be useful for the board design team to produce a comprehensive schedule of the guidance documents they are following in order for future bidders to be clear on the standards that they are expected to comply with. Mm-hmm. Now what he's suggesting there, the preparation of by the board, a comprehensive schedule of guidance documents, that's essentially the first stage of the NDAP process. Is that correct?
Correct.
The fact that Mr. Henderson is suggesting that tends to indicate that at least by this point in time, no NDAP had taken place. Do you agree?
That would be an inference from it, yes. If it hadn't been prepared, that's the schedule we covered earlier as a first requirement of the process.
And if we go to page 883, this is the attachment that Mr. Henderson was sending on with his email. And it's headed up HFS comments on the RHSC DCN independent design review carried out by Atkins for SFT. The following comments relate to the Atkins independent design review dated 12 December 2011. Drawings and detailed information on which the Atkins report was based were not available to HFS, other than a set of proposed reference design drawings dated June-July 2011, previously submitted to ANDS for their design review. So that suggests that the review being done by HFS was on a more limited selection of information than had been available to Atkins. Do you agree? That's what it appears to say.
That's the inference. I think the issue here is also about the timing of when this was conducted. So we're talking about a position in December 2011 when the outline business case hadn't been finalised at this point. So the extent to which the reference design had been developed sufficiently to close all of this out, I'm not clear as to what they should have had access to.
Yeah.
Whether it was simply a question of timing or not.
Okay. And if we go over to page 884, we see there's a reference in the table to space planning and single rooms. See that?
Yes.
And the comment is, well, just really reading the last line. Although the last sentence, sorry. Although the original design work on the re-provision of the RHSC commenced prior to the issue of CEL 48, 2008, there is now an opportunity to realise the considerable benefits of designing to the current standards. So we see there that one of the comments made by HFS is about the extent to which the design complies with existing standards. That's exactly the sort of thing that an NDAP is supposed to pick up.
To be clear, my understanding is that the comment refers to CEL 48 2008, which is in connection with the number of single rooms.
Yes,
Yeah.
That's just an example of the sort of compliance with guidance and policy that HFS are there to detect.
Well, yes, absolutely. Yep. Yeah.
And if we go back to the email chain, page 879, first of all, at the bottom of that page, we see that there's a reply by Heather Chappell, who appears to be with Architecture and Design Scotland.
That's correct.
And she's replying to Peter Henderson, and again, she's copying you in. And rather than me read it out, I'll just give you an opportunity to read that email, Mr. Baxter. You just let me know once you've read it.
Is it just at the bottom of the second bullet point? Yes. Is there more?
Sorry, no, carry on over the page, just to the end of Ms. Chappell's email.
Okay.
So on page 880, halfway through Ms Chappell's email, she says, we understand it's expected that the recommendations in relation to the reference design in the brief will be addressed by the board prior to the ITPD. That's the invitation to participate in dialogue, so part of the procurement process. And then she's saying we'd be happy to do various things. At the end of the second and third bullets, well, at the end of the second bullet, first of all, she says, Pete, who I take it as a reference to Peter Henderson at HFS, Pete has suggested that HFS can carry out a high-level check of the reference design scheme against guidance at this point, which is, I think, the stage of the pre-ITPD key stage review. If this is not being done by others, then the final bullet point, help with evaluating the bidder's responses to the developed design brief for our part in relation to the design quality standards, etc. And HFS could carry out a high-level check against guidance. This is not being done by others. So what appears to be being offered here is the opportunity of a review by HFS of the design against guidance at various points during the procurement process. Is that correct?
That's how I would interpret it, yes.
Do you recall if that offer of that sort of assistance by HFS was taken up?
I have no knowledge as to whether Lothian took up the offer.
I mean, I think if we look at the email, I don't think anybody from NHS Lothian is within the recipients of the email. So I wondered if the offer was essentially being made to you as the chair of the CIG.
Well, looking at the bullet points that are made there, those are functions that would be essentially carried out by the board. CIG wouldn't on the third bullet point. CIG would have no locus in evaluating bidders' responses to the developed design brief. That would be a matter for the board, for the NHS board. In terms of the pre-ITPD key stage review undertaken by SFT, if there would be an opportunity for that key stage review to be picked up in terms of the business case consideration at which both SFT and HFS would be present at CIG when that consideration was being undertaken. So I can't say explicitly whether it was taken up or not, but there would be nothing to preclude their involvement through the process.
I mean, if I can understand it then, that you, insofar as offers were being made of HFS carrying out a high-level check of the design against guidance, you didn't consider that as a matter to be taken up or responded to by you as the chair of the CIG?
Well, that would have been part of an equivalent NDAP process, which the board is responsible for undertaking.
Right. You say the board would be responsible for undertaking the NDAP process. On what basis was the board responsible for undertaking that, having regard to the transitional provisions in the NDAP guidance?
Well, the board has responsibility for the project and for design assurance, so I would expect them to be complying with the requirements of the scheme. Okay.
So this is, you're taking this as a reference to advice and assistance being offered by HFS to the board.
That's how I would read it, given the responsibilities that are set out in the bullet points there.
Well. Could we go please to Bundle 3, Volume 2, Bundle 5, page 63, please.
Thank you.
These are emails being exchanged between people at Davis Langdon and Mott MacDonald, and you were not copied into these emails, Mr Baxter, so there's no reason for you to have seen them before. But I'd just like to invite your comment on what's said in them. The bottom email is from Thomas Brady to Richard Cantley and others, dated the 6th of February 2012. He says, all reference design team have been trying to ascertain for some time now if we need to complete an NDAP review of the scheme. Were you aware of uncertainty or debate about whether or not an NDAP was required?
Not at the time, no. Obviously, reading the material here, there clearly was some uncertainty, but I certainly wasn't aware at the time.
You weren't aware at the time, okay. And just the email at the top is a reply by David Stilley, 6th of February 2012. And he says, I spoke to Peter Henderson, architect at HFS, on 23 January. No clear way forward came out of the meeting, but he did say that everyone present appreciated the RHSC DCN project had been reviewed to death. I was unable to get a definitive answer from him before the last RDT meeting, as he wanted to discuss further with SFT. I think it now falls to NHSL, probably Brian, to move this forward with SFT. I imagine he's reluctant to raise the issue in case it prompts a further round of review meetings. Were you aware at the time of any view that the project had been reviewed to death, as it's put there?
No. And it's not something I would have agreed with.
And why do you say you wouldn't have agreed with it?
Because the review processes that were put in place were to assure appropriate governance over what are large and complex projects. And they're there for a reason.
Were you aware of any reluctance or on behalf of anyone to subject the project to further design review? The
only recollection I have is in terms of ANDS's role, given that they are statutory consultees in the planning process and what role they would play. But I don't think it was a reluctance or a disagreement. I think it was just the fact that they had different roles and different stages of the development of a process.
Okay. If we could go please to Bundle 3, Volume 3, page 175, please. This is an exchange of emails between you and Brian Curry, who's the project director at NHSL, on the 23rd of April 2013. And in the lower email, Mr Curry says to you, Mike, we've arranged a series of meetings between each individual bidder and CEC planning, as you're aware, as we progress through competitive dialogue. A&DS, as a statutory consultee, are part of this process. However, they have informed us that they are to seek clarification from yourself on their role in this project. Given that this project was off and running before the Vision of Health initiative was launched, it has always been our understanding that A&DS will have no role other than as part of the statutory town planning process. This has been the case to date. We have not envisaged them playing a part through the NHS Scotland design assessment process, NDAP, with HFS, for example. Be grateful for your view. And then your reply, Brian, I would not expect our position on NDAP to change on this project going forward. Therefore, I would expect HFS to contribute via the planning process. With regard to the type of review that would have been conducted via HFS as part of the design assessment process, I would expect to challenge this as part of the questioning around the FBC. I will also pursue these issues through my role on the programme board. Does that help you in recall whether or not an NDAP took place?
Yes, it does. And I think actually in the second line of the email, there's an error there that the reference to HFS should actually be Architecture and Design Scotland, given that they have a role via the planning process where it's HF, and I mean the town planning process.
So does this indicate to you that an NDAP did not take place?
Not as such, but that the equivalent processes, so the role at HFS would have pled through the NDAP process was being dealt with in a different way. That's how I would read that.
Okay, so yes. So in other words, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but trying to just capture what I understand you to be saying, that an NDAP as such was not taking place, but the substance of it was being achieved by HFS. Is that a fair summary of
I think that's my interpretation of that, absolutely.
If we go, please, to bundle 5, page 121.
Sorry, my fault. NDAP had not been carried out as such. The equivalent process is just the tense I missed. So would be, had been.
Well, as I said, Lord Brodie, as I said in my written statement, I couldn't recall whether an NDAP or an equivalent process had taken place, and it would appear from this that my understanding is that an equivalent process would have taken place.
Right. My apologies if I'm being slow on this, but you're giving your understanding of what you were saying in the email, and I just haven't followed whether the meaning is that you would expect HFS to carry out equivalent, or you would expect them to have done so.
I would expect them to carry out an equivalent.
Future tense.
Well, bearing in mind where we are here, so 23rd of April 2013, so the outline business case would have been submitted, but the procurement was still live and the full business case hadn't yet been concluded. So, and I can't recall what stage the procurement was at that point in April 2013.
Thank you.
We looked at the guidance for the NDAP review earlier, Mr Baxter, and part of that was reporting at each of the 3 stages: initial agreement, outline business case, full business case. So if an NDAP had been carried out, these reports would exist for each of the business case approval processes for the Sick Kids project. Is that right?
Not for all of them because of the introduction of the guidance, but I would expect material to exist covering the substance of what's covered.
For each of the outline business case and final business case stages.
For the 2012 outline business case and the full business case.
Yeah. And what the procedure required was that those reports would be sent to NHSL and to the Scottish Government. Is that right?
It's my understanding.
And you would have seen an NDAP report as the chair of the CIG if an NDAP had taken place. Is that right?
I would have expected to, yes.
Yeah. And do you recall seeing any NDAP reports as such?
No, as I've said in my written statement.
And so that tends to confirm the view that no NDAP was carried out for the project.
As an NDAP.
As an NDAP, yeah. We can turn briefly to the reference design. You say in your statement that you, the CIG and the Scottish Government were not involved in the detailed development of the reference design.
That's correct.
And you refer to the outline business case for the description set out there, the approach being taken to the reference design. Can we take it from the fact that the outline business case was approved that the CIG and the Scottish Government were content with the approach to the reference design that's described there?
Yes.
And we've seen earlier the Atkins review of the design and some comments by HFS on the Atkins review. Are you aware of any other review of the reference design being carried out by or on behalf of the Scottish Government or the CIG?
And not explicitly, no.
That's what you mean by explicitly, not explicitly.
I can't explicitly remember a separate report being.
Okay. Can't particularly remember.
No.
Yeah, right. What, if any, part did the CIG or other emanations of the Scottish Government, including the SFT, have in approving the environmental matrix or room data sheets?
None.
Should the Scottish Government or SFT have been given a role in approving any departure from standards contained in the reference design?
I would have expected we covered this earlier, so I would have expected any departure to be explicitly referred to by the board, and for the board to have attained appropriate assurances. That should have been explicit.
Were you aware, prior to approval of the outline business case by the Scottish Government, of any declaration by the members of the reference design team about the extent to which the design complied with SHTMs or HTMs?
No.
Could we go please to Bundle 3, Volume 2, page 941?
Thank you.
Just at the bottom of that page, Mr. Baxter, there's an email from Donna Stevenson to Brian Curry. So again, you're not copied in. You wouldn't have seen this, I didn't expect. Okay. And what Donna Stevenson is saying is, Brian, further to the useful meeting on reference design as arranged, I note below the actions we agreed, and she has various actions. And then she says, I attach the table of recommendations from the project review. As you will appreciate, SFT is not signing off on the design. Would you agree that the SFT was not signing off on the design?
So kind of just, that's what the email says, so I'm not sure if you could clarify the question for me, that would be...
I'm sure it's my fault. Would you agree that it wasn't part of the SFT's function to sign off on the reference design?
The reference design was the board's design. If there were issues that were picked up on as part of key stage review, then I would have expected those to have been followed through engagement between SFT and the board, and that prior to CIG considering any of the business cases, then, well, this is pre-invitation to participate in dialogue, so this is in between outline business case and full business case stage. But if any issues had been highlighted, I would have expected them to have been resolved.
At paragraph 89 of your statement, page 107 of the bundle, I don't think we need to go to it, but you can refer to it if you wish, Mr. Baxter. You say that the Scottish Government, through the SFT, used the reference design to establish the forecast capital and revenue costs. First of all, is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. In that process, was the cost of ventilation assessed?
Not explicitly, because at that time there would have been cost allowances for mechanical and engineering, allied to the types of space that were being planned. So not explicitly, but I would expect there to be an a markup based on mechanical and engineering within the cost model.
So did you say that there would have been a cost allowance for ventilation?
It would be included in a broader mechanical and engineering uplift, I would have expected. Okay,
and so would that mechanical and engineering element have been costed up based on designs submitted by BAM in the previous procurement process?
At that stage, I would have expected them to be based on benchmark costs from other projects rather than explicitly for this one.
And would that estimated cost have reflected a ventilation design compliant with the SHTMs or with the environmental matrix?
I can't comment on the specifics. But what I'm saying here is that the cost model itself would have been more general or generic than specifically associated with the environmental assessment or the environmental matrix.
That's understood, thank you. Can I refer you please to page 113 of the witness statement bundle? That's paragraph 121 of your statement.
Yes, I've got that.
And in this paragraph, you say that in relation to the question of to what extent compliance with SHTMs is mandatory, SHTMs are guidance. Some aspects will flow from mandatory requirements set out elsewhere, such as the policy on design quality, which includes 8 mandatory requirements for NHS Scotland health bodies to do various things. What do you say is the basis for the obligation to comply with SHTMs?
So SHTMs are guidance, but effectively they're a code of practice. The mandatory requirements that are set out in the policy on design quality, as we've covered earlier, include the application of the activity database as a mandatory requirement, and that is underpinned by the guidance either from England or indeed as adapted for Scotland.
Can I refer you to paragraphs 123 and 124 of your statement, please, which is page 114 of the witness statement
Yes,
bundle.
I've got that, thanks.
I'll just give you an opportunity to read those again.
$123 and $124.
Yeah, and 124, please.
Yes, I've read that.
Okay. So I understand you there to be saying that it's possible for health boards to derogate from SHTMs. By derogate, do you mean an approved departure from standards in the SHTMs?
The approval of a change from standard. As I've said in my statement, I believe any deviation from existing guidance would require to be justified and risk assessed by the relevant NHS board, and that there would be an audit trail of any deviation from standard.
You indicate in these paragraphs that you expect health boards to liaise with HFS if there's to be a derogation.
Yes.
And what's the basis for the health boards to liaise with HFS if an SHTM is to be departed from?
So HFS are responsible for the preparation of the guidance, and technical expertise sits within HFS. HFS have a purview across NHS Scotland and indeed engagement across the rest of the UK. So in terms of up-to-date advice and guidance, they would be the organisation that I would certainly expect boards to go to. Clearly they'll be taking their own technical advice from their advisors, but in terms of the application of the standard, HFS and clearly, as we've explored, HFS had a role as we move forward in terms of design assessment.
We referred earlier to the NDAP guidance, which had a procedure of sorts for this, in that the Health Board had to produce a list of derogations. Prior to the NDAP process coming in, was there a procedure for derogation and reference to HFS?
Not explicitly, although as I stated earlier, the provisions, the mandatory requirements of the design quality policy and the application of the activity database existed, from 2006.
Okay. Is there a threshold above which permission has to be sought from HFS, or does what we've been discussing apply to any proposed departure from an SHTM?
I don't think there's a threshold, no.
There's another point I've been asked to put to you, Mr Baxter. At paragraph 160 of your statement, which is page 124 of the bundle, if you have that, you'll recall that a number of propositions were put to you, I think, by the inquiry team, and you were asked whether you agreed with them.
Yes.
And I think you've confirmed that you do agree with them. And this is just a point of clarification. At paragraph 10, subparagraph 10 of that, which is at page 125, I'll just read that out. It says that Health Building Note 23, Hospital Accommodation for Children and Young People, 23 October 2014, does not refer to CEL 48 or CEL 27, or to the need for Scottish Government approval of anything less than 100% single rooms. It states that 100% single rooms offered maximum flexibility, 50% single rooms were considered best practice, and so on. So CEL 48 and 27 were SG policies on single bed rooms.
Yes.
If we could go please to bundle 2, page 533. We see there, this is best practice guidance, Health Building Note 23. And then if we go on to page 534, there's a note which reads, this document must be read in conjunction with current Scottish Government policy and NHS Scotland guidance which take precedence. So just from what you see there, do you agree that when HBN 23 was issued in Scotland, it expressly stated that Scottish Government policy took precedence over it?
That's what it says, yes.
And so to the extent that CEL 48 and CEL 27 were extant Scottish Government policy, do you agree that they would have taken precedence over HBN 23?
The most recent one would have, yes.
Thank you very much, Mr Baxter. I have no more questions for you. My Lord, I have endeavoured to cover topics which were raised with me by core participants, but out of fairness to them, the Lordship may wish to check that I've done so to their satisfaction.
Can something arise out of the questioning of Mr Baxter? Mr Ellis, would you like to have a word with Ms McClellan, either at the desk, if it can be done quickly, or you might like to go further? Mr. Ellis.
Followed. Mr. Baxter, you can hear me. This morning, you explained that the business case for the certificate had to go back to the start or back to the beginning after the change to NPP procurement.
And not back to the start. So the outline business case, the initial agreement, which was submitted prior to 2008, there was no need to revisit that. But the fact that DCN had been incorporated into the project was a significant change. So the outline business case needed to be further developed.
Thank you. That clarification probably answers the question, but let me be completely clear about your positions here. The new policy for the NDAP came into force, I think, in a CEL issue July 20.
1st of July, yeah.
The transitional provisions you looked at Bundle 8, page 69 this morning, talked about the transitional. And it was, if the initial agreement had given prior to July 2010, there was no need to do the NDAP, is that right?
That's correct.
And in relation to the sick kids, the initial agreement did not have to be revisited after the change to a different route of procurement.
That's correct.
Thank you very much. Thank you, my lord.
Thank you, Mr. Ellis. Ms. Baxter, that is now the end of your evidence. Possibly a longer day than you anticipated. But from my perspective, these were necessary questions, and I'm very grateful for you providing us with your answers. But now your evidence is complete and you're free to go. So thank you very much indeed again. Now, Ms. McLennan, we have another witness scheduled. My provisional thought is to allow everyone 10 minutes to stretch their legs, also to put the witness on notice. I mean, the witness will probably have been asked to come for 2 o'clock. So first of all, to explain why, from his perspective, not a great deal has happened this afternoon, and just to check that there's nothing affecting the witness, which would make it inappropriate for him to at least commence his evidence. Again, I would be minded not to sit beyond 5 o'clock, but I would be content, subject to anything that anyone has to say, would be content to sit until 5 o'clock.
Well, I'm obliged, my lord. As it happens, there's a degree of overlap between the evidence of Mr. Baxter and Mr. Morrison, and it occurs to me that if I had, perhaps paradoxically, if I had a slightly longer break than 10 minutes, I might be able to hone the examination of Mr. Morrison such that we could complete it today.
Well, in that case, possibly budgeting at about 4 o'clock, but subject to you having had sufficient time. And again, I would propose that all that be explained to Mr. Morrison, and that waiting on a little longer might mean shorter evidence. I think, well, we'll see how things go, but probably 5 o'clock's as long as we could sit. Need be, Mr. Morrison could come back, but that will have knock-on consequences for tomorrow. So we'll rise, hoping to sit here in about 4 o'clock, but subject to Mr. Tennant.
fast.
the good ones.
One of the good ones.
That one's
Now, Mr McLennan, you content to continue?
Yes, I am, my lord, and I'm hopeful that we should be able to complete Mr Morrison's examination before 5 o'clock.
Good afternoon, Mr Morrison. And could I begin by acknowledging the fact that you will have been here since at least 2 o'clock and will have been waiting. So I regret you've had that wait, but you probably understand it's not always possible to predict. You're about to be asked some questions by Mr McClelland. Before then, will you take the oath or would you prefer to affirm?
Affirm.
Sorry?
Affirm, please.
Affirm. Just sitting where you are, if you would repeat these words after me. I solemnly, sincerely and truly
I solemnly and sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
declare and affirm
that I will tell the truth,
I will tell the truth,
the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you, Mr Morrison. Now, you should get some help from the directional microphone, but can I ask you perhaps to speak a little louder than you would in a conversation? Thank you. Mr McLennan.
Thank you, my lord. Can you please confirm your name?
Alan Paul Morrison.
And Mr Morrison, you have, I think, provided 2 statements to the inquiry, and for the benefit of those who have the witness statement bundle, those are at pages 130 to 157. Mr Morrison, the contents of those statements will form part of your evidence to the inquiry. We're able to take much of what you've said as read, and I don't intend this afternoon to trouble you to repeat yourself. But I am going to ask you some brief questions, and if you want to refer to your statement at any time, please do say so. What's your profession?
I'm an accountant.
And when did you qualify?
At 1998.
And do you hold any accountancy qualifications?
Yes, it's with CITFA, which is the Chartered Institute of Public Finance and Accountancy.
And you are currently employed as a civil servant with the Scottish Government, is that correct?
I am.
And what is your current role?
I am Interim Deputy Director of Health, Infrastructure, Investment and PPE.
And how long have you been in that post?
Since about, I took over from Mike Baxter after he left. My role has broadly changed the same, so my job title has changed in that period.
I see. Okay. And so what directorate or department do you work in?
So it's Directorate of Health, Finance, Governance and Value.
And how long have you worked in that directorate?
Over 20 years.
And this inquiry concerns in part the project to develop the Royal Hospital for Children and Young Persons and the Department of Clinical Neurosciences at Little France in Edinburgh. Have you been involved in work on that project?
Yes.
And when did you first become involved with that project?
From about January 2015.
And briefly, what was the nature of your work on that project?
It was initially a kind of focus on the finance side of things, and then kind of throughout, I was the kind of key point of contact between the Scottish Government and NHS Lothian with progress of the project.
We've heard some evidence today about the Capital Investment Group. Have you been involved with that body?
Yes, I currently chair the group.
And when did you become the chairman?
December 2015.
And so if you joined the Capital Investment Group in 2015, have you been involved in approving or recommending for approval any of the business cases for the sick kids at Little France?
So I was not a member of the Capital Investment Group at any stage of the approval process. Latterly, when the full business case came to be approved and the project moved to financial close around about February 2015, I was involved in that process right at the end. But I was not involved in reviewing the detail of the business cases that were submitted over that period.
Okay, and to be clear, you were not on the Capital Investment Group when that full business case came for approval. The inquiry has already heard plenty of evidence about SHTMs, or Scottish Health Technical Memoranda, and you've discussed these in your statement. The nature of these has been described by another witness to the inquiry in the following way, and I would just like to put this to you and ask you whether or not you agree. What he has said is that those not close to the issue might assume that they, that is SHTMs, are an instruction manual handed out by the government. This is not the case. They are the health service's interpretation of the responsibility it has under the applicable legislation, regulations, codes of practice and government policy. Is that a description that you would agree with?
Yes.
Paragraph 36 of your statement, Mr Morrison, for those with the bundle, that's at page 143. You're discussing, in fact, if you could just get that up in front of you. You're discussing here the process under which the Capital Investment Group reviews business cases. And in the course of doing that, you say that the Capital Investment Group is conscious to ensure that the business case is fully compliant with the SPFM and SCIM guidance and requirements. Do you see that?
Yes.
Or recall it? Yeah. Does that include ensuring that the project goes through the NDAP, or the NHS Scotland design assessment process?
Yes.
Can we please have the document at Bundle 3, Volume 3, at page 893? Do you have that on the screen in front of you, Mr Morrison?
Yes.
And do you recognise that document?
Yes, I do.
And could you just explain to us what that is?
It's the Scottish Capital Investment Manuals. This is the guidance that we have prepared to assist NHS boards in preparation and production of business cases.
And if we go please to page 902 of that bundle.
Sorry, my fault. Which page?
I'm sorry, my lord, I seem to have the wrong page reference myself, so. I'm sorry, my lord, bear with me a moment, try and find the right reference. Sorry, the correct page is 1237.
Thank you.
And do you see that on the screen, Mr Morrison?
Oh, yeah. Yes.
Okay, and do you recognise that document?
Yes, it's commonly referred to as NDAP. It's guidance for the design assessment process that NHS boards follow.
And do we see at the bottom of that page, it says latest drafting 2nd of February 2017. Do you know if that's the current version of?
It is, yes.
It is. And does that guidance still apply to projects today?
Very much so.
And also at paragraph 36 of your statement, you say that CIG is concerned to note that all relevant requirements have been met, such as technical specifications. Can I just ask you to clarify what you mean by technical specifications?
So it would cover the SHTM guidance, that the suite of documents that Health Facilities Scotland prepare for to assist NHS Scotland in not only the production of their business cases but the management of their wider estate. But we would be particularly focused on expectation that would be that they would follow it in terms of any new developments.
Okay. And you go on to say that if the Health Board undertakes that a certain element of its design is compliant with the relevant technical memorandum, then CIG does not check that the actual design is, as a matter of fact, compliant. That's what you say in paragraph 36. So, do you mean that the CIG takes Health Boards at their word that designs are compliant with the relevant technical memorandums?
So we would take assurance that the NDAP process would, to some extent, check on the compliance with technical standards and guidance. But we would not, or the Capital Investment Group would not look for further assurance beyond that.
Okay. And I don't think it's necessary to go to the guidance that, unless you would find it helpful, Mr Morrison, so please do say so if that's the case. The inquiry's already seen guidance. The process, as I understand it, is that the Health Board is expected to produce a list of the guidance with which it considers its project is required to comply, together with a schedule of derogations from that. Is that your understanding?
That would be my understanding, but it's not. It doesn't form part of any submission to the Capital Investment Group.
Okay. That information, where would that information go?
I would expect it to be held locally.
And by locally, you
locally
mean?
By the local health board that is developing a particular business case. We would not typically, any part of Scottish Government would not. I would not expect them to submit it to Scottish Government for review or assessment.
Would you expect it to be submitted to Health Facilities Scotland for review?
I think it kind of depends on where Health Facilities Scotland, they're there to provide advice and guidance to the Health Board over and beyond just preparing written guidance. So if there was an issue that they wanted to move away from, then I could certainly anticipate them at times speaking to Health Facilities Scotland to either get a view or help form a judgment. But if a board thought they could deal with an issue locally, they thought they had professional expertise and experience to deal with it themselves, then I would assume that would be absolutely fine.
If we go into the NDAP guidance document at page 1241, just reading there from the text just above the box, it says, NDAP will assess for compliance with current published design guidance. To facilitate this, boards' clients must submit at initial agreement business case stage a project-specific list of the guidance they consider applicable to their development. This will be updated at OBC and FBC stage and will include any derogations. together with the technical reason for this proposed mitigation. And then there's a list of the guidance that the projects submitted for NDAP will have to be assessed for compliance with. I had understood that that information was being submitted, or was to be submitted by the Health Board to HFS. Are you saying something different when you say that the information is being held locally at the Health Board?
No, so as part of the NDAP process, they will submit information to Health Facilities Scotland, but there can be derogations out with the NDAP process, even during the construction phase. So when I mentioned that that kind of thing was held locally, that's what it was meaning, rather than NDAP, where it would go through HFS.
Okay. And if a derogation is sought outside of the NDAP process, is that something that comes to the attention of the Capital Investment Group, or does that rest with the Health Board and possibly?
Not typically. So since I've been chairing the Capital Investment Group, there's not been one occasion where a Health Board has approached me in my capacity as chair to say, can we derogate from whatever standard or requirement there is. So the one exception I'm aware of is the single room issue. That obviously happened before I was involved with SIG, but it was high profile enough that I was aware of it.
And for those sorts of derogations, the ones that aren't coming to the attention of the Capital Investment Group, are you aware of whether or not there's a procedure to be followed in relation to that?
So I would expect there to be a procedure. My understanding, and you'll probably get a better idea when you speak to colleagues from NHS Lothian, is derogations are not unusual, and so there will be a process to be followed, and I would expect it to be kind of it would depend on the scale of the change that you're looking at. Would depend on the type of process in place, but I would expect to see it evidenced and signed off by an appropriate either corporate body or professional.
Am I right to understand what you're saying as being that the question of the derogation and the judgment to be made in relation to it is for the Health Board itself?
Yes.
And it's not something that would necessarily require the approval of the Scottish Government?
No.
Now, at paragraph 37 of your statement, and I think you must be talking here about the process of business case approval before the Capital Investment Group. You say that it would be for the board to identify the derogation and seek approval from the Capital Investment Group. And then at paragraph 47, you say that the Capital Investment Group expects a business case presented to it to be compliant with the relevant SHTMs. It is for the board to guarantee compliance. You accept that as being what you say
Yes.
in your statement. What's the basis for your view that a board is obliged to seek approval for any derogation from inter alia SHTMs?
I think that there's an element of kind of speculation there as to what would happen if there was any significant movement from the agreed guidance. I suppose that one thing I would kind of point out that there may be derogations that happen during the construction phase. So once the business case has been approved and SIG's involvement effectively has come to an end, that there would be derogations as they go through the construction phase.
The question is really concerned with identifying the basis for what you say in your statement, that it's for the board to guarantee compliance. What's the the basis for that view?
It's partly through the NDAP process that kind of reviews what processes have followed, but also that if they were to if there was any kind of significant movement from the guidance, I would expect it to be kind of raised with us when the business case has been developed. But it's not something that happens very often.
Okay. Do you accept that it's up to health boards to set their clinical requirements for their rooms, and it's only when those requirements have been set one can then identify the guidance in the SHTM which is relevant for that room?
Yes, I think that's a fair assessment.
At paragraph 39 of your statement, you describe a two-stage approval for PPP projects. Part 2 is at financial close. Would you expect health boards to be able to say at financial close whether or not the design meets the requirements of the SHTMs?
So at financial close, my understanding at that point is that it's more the project financing that is being resolved right at the end. All the design aspects of the business case would have been considered and reviewed prior to that as part of the submission to the Capital Investment Group.
So, I mean, the question was whether you would expect health boards to be able to say at that point whether or not the design meets SHTMs. Are you saying that you would or you would not expect them to be able to say?
Yes, I would expect that.
You would. And would you expect and would you expect a health board to be able to say that a reference design met the requirements of SHTMs?
So the expression that the reference design, which I know you discussed earlier today, was not it's not something I'm particularly familiar with, and so I'm probably not best qualified to make that judgment.
Okay. Well, are you aware of whether there was any procedure to deal with the situation where the design is not finalised at financial close and one cannot say as a matter of fact whether it is or will be 100% compliant with SHTMs?
So I would expect at financial close pretty much everything to be finalised at that stage.
Yes, you would expect that it would be finalised, but are you aware of whether there's a procedure to deal with the situation where the design is not finalised? In the specific context of knowing whether or not the design is compliant with the SHTMs?
I don't know. I would make an assumption that that's the case, but I don't know if I could evidence it.
Is it important for derogations which affect revenue cost, value for money, or delivery of clinical services to be made clear in the business case?
I'm not sure the business case would go into that level of detail.
At paragraph 10 of your statement, Mr Morrison, you have a heading which is NHS Scotland Design Assurance Process. can I clarify with you that the correct name for the process is in fact the NHS Scotland Design Assessment Process?
Yes.
You would agree that that assessment is the correct term?
Yes.
I mean, that is on one view just a matter of labelling, but is there in your view any significance in the difference between design assessment and design assurance?
So, there's clearly a difference, and one of the things that we have recently kind of introduced is a key stage assurance review led by NHS Assure that is very specifically there to give us an assurance that their review of critical systems is has been that they are satisfied with what the board is proposing. The design assessment process is slightly different, and while I'm not kind of fully aware of the detail that kind of goes behind the NDAP review, there is, I know it's a collaborative approach, so it does take some time to take all the information available and to form a judgment on it. And ultimately they provide a recommendation on the status of the project, and it forms part of the SIG review.
Okay, we've looked at the 2017 guidance for the NHS Scotland Design Assurance process. I'd like to ask you a question about, well, that relates to the earlier version from 2011. So if you could go please to bundle 8 at page 63. If you've got that page on screen, Mr Morrison, that's just the front page of the guidance. You'll see that it's dated the 5th of July 2011. And if we go please to page 69, you see there a heading, Transitional Arrangements.
Yes.
I mean, are you familiar with this, Mr Morrison, that there were transitional arrangements that applied to the NDAP guidance from 2011?
So I wasn't aware of it, but I'm not surprised that that there are transitional arrangements, that when, because major capital projects cover such a long period of time, there is a point that where if guidance does change, there's a judgment as to how it applies to projects that have already started. So in principle, I can understand why the specifics I'm probably not best placed to comment on. Okay,
but I understand that the transitional provision doesn't appear in the 2017 version of the guidance. Can I ask you if there was a change of policy within the Scottish Government, with the Scottish Government taking the view that all projects considered by the CIG would have to undergo an NDAP? Was there a change of policy about that, or was it simply that the transitional provisions had served their purpose?
I think the end result is the same. Whether it was the basis for making that determination, I don't know, but ultimately it meant that all business cases submitted to the Capital Investment Group would need an NDAP review, an NDAP sign-off before we would approve any part of it.
Yeah. Could we go please to Bundle 3, Volume 3, page 1309.
Sorry, Mr. McLean, could you give me the page again?
1309.
Thank you.
And this is an exchange of emails that you refer to in your statement, Mr Morrison. You may recall it. If we go down to the bottom of the chain, which is at page 1310, you see there it's an email from you to Susan Grant at NHS NSS.
Yes.
And who is Susan Grant?
So she was the principal architect at Health Facilities Scotland.
Okay, and you send her an email dated the 5th of July 2019. Hey Susan, I'm sure you can guess why I'm asking this question. If a new hospital was being designed and the ventilation system in a critical care unit had a non-compliant number of air changes per hour, would the NDAP review pick that up? If not, what would we need to do to make sure that it did? Can I ask you, first of all, was your question hypothetical in the sense that in this email, at least, you're not making any comment one way or the other about whether or not an NDAP had in fact been carried out on the Sick Kids project?
So I'm pretty sure when I asked the question, I was unaware whether an NDAP review had been undertaken. I don't think it even really crossed my mind to consider whether it had or not. It was more just trying to understand. Clearly, with it being the 5th of July, it was after the problems at the Edinburgh Children's Hospital had been uncovered. It was just to understand, what went wrong and what would we need to do to avoid that situation repeating.
I mean, do you know whether or not an NDAP review was carried out on that project? You said you didn't know, I think, at the time you wrote your email, but...
At the time I didn't. I've certainly not... I've looked for one and I've not found it. So my understanding is an NDAP review was not undertaken, albeit I'm aware that there's perhaps kind of comparable kind of reviews that were undertaken, that perhaps would have replicated what NDAP would have done. Mm-hmm. But I'm not sure about the detail of that.
Okay. Now, you say to Ms. Grant that you're sure she can guess why you're asking the question, but what had prompted your question?
It's the fact that we had heard that the Edinburgh Children's Hospital, that there was the independent tester had, when they were completing their final kind of checks just prior to the hospital services moving over, had noticed that the air change rate in the critical care units were not compliant with current standards.
Yeah. And so you're asking Ms. Grant whether, in her view, an NDAP review would have picked that up. By the time you sent that email, you'd been on the CIG for 3 or 4 years, I think. Is that correct?
Yes.
And the NDAP review was part of the CIG's business case review process. Did you yourself have a view on whether or not an NDAP should have picked that issue up?
I mean, given how serious the consequences of the problem emerging, I think it's kind of fair to kind of think, well, what do we need to do to ensure that doesn't happen? I suppose because the detail behind what the reviews undertake, the fact that hospital buildings are so complex that there's I suppose a balance between what you can realistically kind of review independently and what you, if you like, kind of delegate and trust to the board delivering the project. So it's I think that it's I suppose it's always, we're looking at it with the benefit of hindsight, but clearly it's something that in retrospect that we would have wanted to have spent more time looking at.
Okay, and if we read up to the next email in the chain, which is Ms. Grant's reply to you, and she says, "Hi Alan, so a quick answer is maybe's aye, maybe's no. As you know, NDAP is only a proportionate review, and we may or may not catch the many details in each project. What I can say is if we saw this in the derogation list that NDAP asks for, we would flag it as a risk and request further details plus technical reasons why. Do you agree that part of Ms Grant's response amounts to saying that the NDAP would pick up that air changes were non-compliant if the Health Board itself had identified that they were?
Yes.
So at least under the NDAP process, it's really for the Health Board to flag up whether there are departures from guidance.
Yes.
Under the process as it stands, or as it then stood at the time of your email.
Yes. I suppose if that is certainly if it was a planned departure.
Yes. And was it any part of the scope or purpose of the NDAP to detect unintentional departures from guidance?
I'm probably not best placed to kind of comment on that. I think that would be difficult for the process to pick these things up.
At paragraphs 48 to 56 of your statement, which is page 146 on, you describe a body called NHS Scotland Assure.
Yes.
Is that a new body?
It is relatively new.
And when was it set up?
Almost immediately after the issues at the Edinburgh Children's Hospital, there was a commitment in the programme for government, which was published in September 2019, effectively saying that we will introduce a body that will have oversight over the design, construction, maintenance of NHS major infrastructure developments. NSS, or National Services Scotland, were commissioned with developing a blueprint for identifying how they would actually do that, implement it. And then from about March the next year, there was a kind of shadow service that was in operation, and they started introducing key stage assurance reviews for our big construction projects, which there's not that many in development. And then that is that NHS Assure were formally launched later on, and now it's an embedded part of our process. My understanding is NHS Assure are still looking to fully staff and have there's more staff that they're looking to employ. So it's still in development, but it's a change in our assurance process.
Okay. To what extent was NHS Scotland Assure set up in response to issues in the built environment at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Glasgow and the sick kids in Edinburgh?
It was a joint thing. As you'll be aware, that there were obviously ongoing issues at the Queen Elizabeth prior to July 2019, but the fact that the problems that we experienced at the Children's Hospital in Edinburgh were so significant that I think ministers felt there was no other choice but to do things differently. And I think there was an acceptance in the service that it was an appropriate thing to do.
Sorry, Mr Morrison, I just missed that last sentence.
So across NHS Scotland, those involved with capital infrastructure projects, I think they accepted that given two of our biggest projects had experienced problems, that we needed to do something differently.
Thank you.
Is it intended, Mr Morrison, that the NHS Scotland Assure will have a role in ensuring that health boards comply with HFS guidance such as SHTMs?
Yes.
And how will it do that?
So they will, again, I suppose that I might not be the best person to kind of make these judgments, but it's quite an intensive process. So it is, they will work closely with the boards. They will meet and discuss their plans on a regular basis. They will review their plans, or review their design statements, their architectural kind of drawings, and they will speak to them regularly.
If we go to paragraph 52 of your statement at page 147 of the bundle, you begin by referring to the business case review process undertaken by the CIG, and then you say that NHSSA work with the Health Board during the preparation and presentation of its business case. In particular, NHSSA will review business case proposals to ensure compliance with relevant technical standards and guidance. From 1 June 2021, all health boards that require review and approval for CIG will need to engage with NHSSA to undertake key stage assurance reviews. Approval from CIG will only follow once the KSAR has been satisfactorily completed. KSARs have been designed to provide assurance from the Scottish Government, assurance to the Scottish Government. Guidance such as HSTMs has been followed. To what extent does that differ from the NDAP procedure that was already in place?
It's a more intensive review and more thorough review of the key systems in a hospital build. Okay,
and you've described it as more thorough. In terms of who could explain to us what that thoroughness involves, would that be somebody from NHS Assure, or is that something that you could?
I think NHS Assure would be better, and I believe you've got witnesses from NHS Assure that will give evidence to the inquiry and certainly do a better job than me.
And at paragraph 53, you say that NHSSA's engagement does not change accountability for the projects. Health boards remain accountable for their delivery, and NHSSA will be accountable for the services it provides to support delivery of the health board's projects. So, in short, it's the health board's responsibility to ensure its hospitals comply with the guidance.
Yes.
Can I ask you just a point of language, really? At paragraph 52 of your statement, it's the second last sentence. You've used this phrase, NHSSA will review business case proposals to ensure compliance with relevant technical standards and guidance. And it's that word ensure. Just ask you about that. Does the word ensure accurately reflect the degree of responsibility that's placed on NHS Assure?
Well, obviously, ensure implies that nothing will go wrong, and this will be. And I think the degree of complexity in a modern hospital build might mean that is it'll fall some way short of 100% of assurance. Yeah, I think that would be kind of a better way of putting it.
Are you able to say what resources will be available to NHS Assure for carrying out this function?
So we government are committed to supporting NHS Assure setting up. So effectively, we commissioned National Services Scotland to design a kind of team that would be appropriate for work that we're asking, and then they have provided us with a cost or an estimated cost as to what that will be, and we have supported it. So, and it's a substantial cost. So it's been driven by NHS Assure themselves rather than any budget limitations that Scottish Government have imposed.
Now, I think you've perhaps answered this question already, but could NHS Assure realistically carry out a comprehensive check that every proposed hospital project will comply with every aspect of guidance?
So it is, so in part it will be determined by how ambitious our hospital build projects or programme is. And it's also that the people NHS Assure are looking to employ are in high demand. So I know that they've been recruiting for engineers and architects, and it's that they're competing against the wider market. So we have kind of streamlined the process a bit. That at the moment, until they're up to full establishment, the focus of the work is on outline business case and the full business case stage. The initial agreement, because that's more a strategic intent of what the service is going to do. They're just given a very kind of high level kind of review of the board's proposal, whereas outline and full business case, it is a full intensive review of what they're proposing.
And a final point, just of clarification, Mr Morrison, at paragraph 4 of your statement, which is page 130, just reading from that, what you say is that in or around 2005, the Scottish Futures Trust developed the non-profit distributing model, the replacement to the traditional PFI model then in use in capital infrastructure projects and so on. It's been suggested to me that that might not be quite correct, in that the SFT did not exist in 2005. I'm told that it was not incorporated until 2008 and became operational in 2009. Would you disagree with that?
No.
And if I was to put to you the following, that the NPD model was developed around 2005, but not by the SFT, and that the SFT evolved the NPD model from 2010 or so, would you disagree with any of that?
No.
Thank you, Mr Morrison. Those are all the questions that I have for you, although it's possible that others may have questions. My Lord, I have nothing more to ask Mr Morrison, but others may do.
Thank you, Mr McLennan. Does anything arise from Mr McLennan's questioning of Mr Morrison? Right. I see no indication that anything does arise. Therefore, Mr Morrison, that's the end of your evidence. Thank you very much for coming to give us evidence. Thank you for waiting patiently in order to do so. But that's the end of your evidence, and you're free to go. Thank you very much. Now, we have witnesses tomorrow, Mr McLennan, and beginning at 10 o'clock.
10 o'clock, and it's Mr McGregor who will be back tomorrow, my Lord.
Thank you. Well, we'll see each other tomorrow at 10.